one of the best parts of making these videos is to hear from real people who are out there playing D&D. And they often ask a question about some aspect of a video that I mention in passing. But after I look at their comment, I realize, they're right. I should unpack that a little bit more. And so a new video is born. So a longtime subscriber, Joel Anderson, commented after a video I made on how to make your campaign fun that I had just sort of mentioned in passing about creating encounters that you could drop in anywhere. So Joel had said, you briefly touched on the topic of having drop-in encounters that they're ready for when your players go off track. Can you elaborate on how you do that? I found my encounters are so tightly tied to a specific place, or they've been tailored to furthering a planned plot, that they don't work out so well out of context. For example, my wilderness encounter that takes place in a blizzard can't really be repurposed when the players follow the trade routes through the city instead of finding a pass through the mountains. Now, first of all, Joel, can I elaborate? Oh yes, I can elaborate. Hello again, folks. KR King here again to help you homebrew your own campaign. As Joel pointed out in his question, the encounters that we conceive before the session, sort of preset encounters, are almost always tied either to a storyline that we're unveiling for the players or there's some geographical location. And that makes you think, well, I can't really just plug that in anywhere, sort of a random monster or something, an improvised situation. You're not going to meet many mermen in a desert or Yeti in a swamp, although you could. And Joel points out how our pre-game planning can get interrupted when players get off track. If you're going to have a sandbox campaign, which I like to play, you have to accept the fact that players are going to do what players want to do. So there's really two strategies to answering Joel's question. The first is to create drop-in encounters that aren't dependent on any sort of geography or tied to any storylines. And the other is to figure out, well, how can I adapt a set, drop-in sort of unique encounter to specific geography the players are in or to storylines that I'm trying to promote in my campaign. So the first strategy is pretty straightforward. You're thinking up an encounter that can occur anywhere. Now, you might think that you always divide land and sea encounters, but in fact, in the middle of the ocean, you can have islands, and you can have lakes on a landmass. And you could also divide encounters above ground and below. But caverns can occur anywhere in the world, and so too a lost dungeon. We're in a fantasy environment. You can have some keep that was built wherever you want. Boom, you have the entrance to a dungeon. So any below ground encounter can be used pretty much in any sort of geographic area. As for above ground, it's usually only the extremes of geography that limit where a creature can appear. I can't really imagine a band of Yeti being encountered in a swamp. And it's the same with a town or city adventure. I can imagine any kind of humanoids in a city environment or any kind of creatures, in a dungeon beneath, but a band of Yeti? Now, the GM in me loves this kind of challenge, of course. Now, let me think here. A family of Yeti were kidnapped from their Arctic mountain home and taken to the city to be exhibited in a zoo. But they escaped, and they moved into an abandoned sewer system where they now live. No, wait. They escaped the zoo, ran off, and hid in a nearby swamp. Pretty good, huh? Now, the classic drop-in encounter that most GMs use is a random encounter. The players are moving from point A to point B. They're out in the wilderness or, in a dungeon or something, and they run into a monster because the wilderness/dungeon is a dangerous place to be, and you get encountered there. So you roll a random encounter and you say, okay, I've got these presets. Where does it work in terms of, eliminating the geographic oddities? How am I going to plug this in? And what you do here is you think of the how and the why of the encounter. Why are the players encountering this creature or creatures in this time and place? And then how does the encounter unfold tactically? And of course, this presumes that you're not running the old style dungeon crawl where you just have a series of rooms and the players move through and they run into whatever monster is there. It doesn't make rhyme or reason. It's just, here's another monster, here's another monster. So we're sort of eliminating that, although that can be really fun to play. But other than this dungeon crawl concept, we're going to assume that when players confront creatures, either above or below ground or on or below the water, there's some reason that the creatures are there. And I tend to scale this reason with the intelligence of the creatures that are encountered. A creature with a 1 intelligence, whether it's a scorpion or a purple worm, interacts with its environment purely on an instinctual level. It just moves through the world and sort of encounters things. They don't think about what they do. And in fact, very low intelligence monsters and giant animals and things are classic random monsters because they are just kind of wandering through the world looking for food. They're easy to do because being low intelligence monsters, we don't worry much about the tactics. They tend to attack, and then sometimes if things go badly, they'll run off. Now, in the old days, if you look at the random monster charts, you could roll up an ancient red dragon. This is why, the old school D&D was so deadly. And I think in modern D&D, unless you're in some very special place, the abyssal plane or some horrific place, you're not just going to roll up a random monster, oh, you run into a lich. Because a powerful creature has influence and renown. The players are going to know about them as they approach, right? And they're going to affect the area around where they live. But of course, when you have a preset encounter, when you've prepared it before the run, even creatures of the 1 intelligence, if you're going to spend time on it, there's something there. So the giant wasps have made their hive in an old dungeon, right? And so when you go there, that's going to lead to something else. But again, that's limited. I mean, typically you're going to create a preset encounter with creatures of a higher intelligence because they begin to organize themselves. They have a place they live. They have a preset area that they patrol. Their activities are more organized because they're more intelligent. Now, of course, you can homebrew any creature and alter its stat. That you can take a preset encounter that you've already made and plug it in because you can scale it for the level of the players. Again, you don't want to necessarily do this for some, big bad villain thing or whatever. But again, something that you've created that you think is cool, this monster or whatever, but it's a little too deadly, just scale it back a bit. Or it's a little too easy, scale it up. And another thing you can do is add verisimilitude to a preset encounter when you plug it in by including the terrain effects into the monster or situation that you're doing. So if you have a purple worm encounter, but you're in the desert, it becomes a sandworm. The bandits become mounted on, camels or something in the desert. And this change in terrain affects the tactics. How do the players come across the encounter? How soon do they see them? And then what is the terrain like to fight a battle? It's much easier to see things in the desert or plains than it is the swamp or jungle, but it goes both ways. The creatures that the players are encountering, you might see them from a long ways off. So the players might meet an advance party, scouts as it were, of some encounter you've created. Do they track them back to their lair? Do they see a campfire in the distance? Do they hear the sounds of a battle? Do the creatures have a settlement, a lair? Do they have lookouts? How defensible is their setup? And again, you can think about if you've set something up for the woods and now you're in the mountains, you can adapt it a little bit to say, within this mountain environment, there's this scrub trees or whatever, and plop it right in. And that's why caves are great to have as lairs, because you can have them anywhere. You can have a little rise of hills and look, a cave. And so you've removed the geographic oddity situation. You say these creatures could appear there. You've determined how to adapt this to the terrain. It's still going to be the native intelligence of these creatures as to determining how the players are going to meet them. If they're low intelligence, they're just going to be like the fauna, just part of the environment. Higher intelligence, they have more of an impact. They have relationships with other groups. And this is going to determine, again, when you're plugging it in, you have to just think, well, if these hobgoblins are right here, the villagers over here are going to be aware of it. The other thing that when you plug stuff in, you got to think, do they have goals? Do they have objectives? You may have created them for a preset encounter that maybe isn't adapted to this. You can just sort of remove that and have the encounter and then take that goal and give it to someone else. All right, the next thing is to connect a preset plugin to a storyline that you want to unfold. Now you can connect the storylines to the encounters directly or tangentially. And as we talked about, you thought the players were going to go in this direction and they went in this direction, but this storyline is moving along. The clock is ticking or whatever. So you want to make sure they're aware of that. And there's many ways to do this. So let's say that you've got this preset encounter that you thought up where these hobgoblins are harassing a village. And the players are going from point A to point B. They come across some villagers or whatever, and they decide, you know what, we're going to go and eliminate this threat, these hobgoblins. And you can scale it up or down depending on the level of the party. But say you want to connect it to a storyline. So let's say you've got this ongoing storyline about this group of evil humans who are conspiring to overthrow a king. And one of the things maybe they're trying to do is to show that his rule is collapsing, he's not keeping people safe. So you take the hobgoblin encounter and you add a hobgoblin warlord who is working for this group of evil humans. And the players defeat the hobgoblins and they find some documents that are connecting them to this conspiracy. A direct connection. So now the players have learned something about this major storyline in your campaign, and they have to decide whether they're going to act. Are they going to go back and warn the king or whatever? They're going to have to act even though they went off track from where you thought they were going to go. And by the way, they can still ignore it. It's a sandbox campaign. You can also use plugin encounters to connect to stories tangentially. So it's the same hobgoblin encounter, maybe not with the hobgoblin warlord. The players defeat them, and they find in their belongings an old book or even a map that leads to a ruined temple, lost temple in a jungle nearby. And that's a tangential connection, but these are really useful to introducing new storylines to players. And the other nice thing about introducing it this way, just some old dusty map, who knows where the hobgoblins found it, lost 100 years ago, they just picked it up. The players are the only ones who have this information. Because if this legend of this temple was out there, people would have explored the jungle, they would already have looted it, but now the players have something unique. So every review, hobgoblins can live anywhere. So if you've got a plug-in with the hobgoblins and they have a little settlement that they operate out of, the players can just come across that, fight them. You can also have a tangential relationship to some other story or not. It can just be standalone. But you can also plug it in and connect it to a storyline that you have. Adding the hobgoblin warlord, he has a connection to this conspirators in town. And you can do this, you can scale them up and down. The point is you've created the hobgoblin encounter, you've thought about they're harassing villagers, or if it's in the absolute middle of nowhere, they're just living like hobgoblins living off the land. And you can scale it up or down because you don't know where this drop-in plug-in is going to happen in terms of the advancement level of the players as they move through your world. Because the thing about D&D, when you wander the wilderness or the Underdark or wherever, it's a dangerous place. But it's also seeded with information about great treasure and magic that's there for the taking. So if you like what you've seen, please subscribe. I'm always looking for more. Please leave some comments, ask questions like Joel. I love to answer them. They're great videos. But in the meantime, my friends, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.